Shalom, good afternoon. So I'm Tovim, Erev Tov, Boker Tov, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all those who are watching. I know we have people from around the world and across North America and in Israel, of course. It's a pleasure to have you join us. My name is Rabbi Josh Weinberg, and I serve as the Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the URJ and as the Director of Artza. And I'm pleased to bring you this program together with our friends from Artzenu, the International Organization of Reform Zionists. Today, we have a very important program and timely, of course, as we are looking to now 13 days away from the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And with us to discuss some of their foreign policy implications, specifically for Israel and the Middle East, we have an expert panel. I'm looking forward to that. I want to begin by saying that I think that the world was deeply shaken and disturbed and troubled by the horrific events that took place in the capital of Washington, D.C. in the United States yesterday afternoon, where we saw a pro-Trump mob stage an insurgence into the Capitol building, a violent break-in of the Capitol, really threatening the sanctity and the shrines of our democracy. With us to discuss that and more, we are very pleased that we have such experts, Washington insiders, who also look at the world through foreign policy. With us is, of course, the editor-at-large Foreign Policy magazine, Jonathan Tepperman. We are joined by former ambassador of the United States to Israel, Dan Shapiro, and of course, Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes of the Brookings Institute. I will say, of course, that none of our panelists and our guests today are strangers to the reform movement. Many of them have spent a great deal of time, whether it's our URJ summer camps or the Religious Action Center, and members of our congregations. They are not strangers to us. And I know that their presence here will be helpful to so many people who are struggling to understand the events of yesterday and to help put them in a broader, even global perspective. So I want to welcome people. And as all you are following at home or wherever you are, I want to encourage you to write in on Facebook or on YouTube who you are and where you're watching from. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan Tepperman, who will be moderating our discussion today.
Well, thanks so much, Josh, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in. You know, I want to start by echoing Josh's comments. I know that we've gathered to talk about the Middle East, but the events in Washington yesterday were so disturbing that it's hard to focus on anything else right now. I don't know about you, but I spent most of yesterday afternoon watching TV in this state of shock and despair. Today, somewhat to my surprise, I'm starting to feel a little more optimistic, strange as that may sound. I think there are two reasons for that. The first is that, you know, American democracy did ultimately prevail last night. The constitutional mechanism worked the way that it was supposed to, and Joe Biden's presidential victory was certified. The other reason I'm feeling hopeful today is that the repudiation of the people responsible for yesterday's horror show, and here I'm referring to Trump and his enablers, not just the thugs who stormed the Capitol. The repudiation has been so widespread that it gives me a little bit of nascent hope that this country may finally be starting to turn the page and may finally be ready to push Trump and his enablers to the fringes where they deserve to be. But that may all be premature and naive, and everything is still up in the air. So I want to bring in our expert panelists and ask you, Tammy and Dan, about your reactions to yesterday. And in order to connect them to our main subject, which is the Middle East, I'm especially curious to hear about how you think yesterday played abroad and what impact you think it will have on U.S. policy and U.S. standing in the region. Tammy, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Well, I can't help but start with thinking about this from a personal perspective as an American, as a resident of the city of Washington, as somebody who has walked those halls in the Capitol building many, many times. And I think of my friend Dan, who spent years working in that building, what yesterday must have felt like. So, you know, there's the anxiety, and also just the anger and humiliation of seeing that desecration of a building that we call, with good reason, the people's house. So it's hard to get past those emotions to analyze. I think one thing I've been reflecting on a lot is I've seen a lot of commentary out there, some of it schadenfreude, some of it sadness, that, well, America always seemed like an exception, but American exceptionalism is dead because of this event, or even just because of what we've seen over the last 4 years. I personally, and I have spent a large chunk of my career working on global democracy. I sit on the board of the National Democratic Institute, which works to strengthen democracy globally. And I don't think American exceptionalism has ever been properly understood. An argument that America is above reproach, America's democracy is better than everybody else's, or that we've got it all figured out. Democracy everywhere is a work in progress. Democracy everywhere is fragile because the consent of the governed relies on their willingness to trust the institutions of government and the processes by which they elect their representatives. You know, one of the things I've been doing a lot since the events of the summer and our national conversation about race is I've been reading a lot of James Baldwin. James Baldwin, an African-American intellectual from New York City, spent a lot of his working life in Paris, outside our country, because he was so frustrated and constrained as a Black man, as a queer Black man, writing about American injustice, racial injustice. But James Baldwin never lost faith in American democracy. In fact, it was his confidence in the values at the root of American democracy that made him angry when America was falling short in fulfilling those values. And I think it's ultimately that faith that we can correct. You know, and as you said, Jonathan, members of Congress looked into the abyss yesterday, went back to the floor of Congress and did their jobs. So that is very much what I take away. It's not that we have perfection, but we have faith.
Dan, I wonder if you can speak to the second half of the question, which is, what impact do you think this is going to have on how the United States is seen and its ability to act in the rest of the world, specifically the Middle East?
Sure. Well, first I want to echo what both you and Tamara have said about the personal impact of those awful scenes yesterday. I do know those halls very well, but for any American to see our democratic bastion taken over by a mob, our constitutional process is disrupted, to see that encouraged and incited by the President of the United States himself, was a shaking, I'm still shaking, kind of event. I was outraged. I was heartbroken. And while it's true, it ended in the right way in the sense of the work getting done once the mob was removed. I think some of the tremors linger, that it could have happened, and that people are still out there who may try to do similar things in the future. So it's a moment of grave importance that we focus on what we need to do to move past that. By the way, it's also a moment to think about how close we might have come, either in a second Trump administration, or if he had managed to do what he tried to do, which was to steal an election and he lost, how much worse it could have been for American democracy. But what I would say is that I've heard also from many friends today in Israel, where I am, and from other countries around the world, how shaken they were, how much our friends, America's democratic allies, and even some of our allies who are not fully democratic, and certainly within those societies, those who aspire to take their systems of government in a direction of more democracy, openness, and participatory governance, how much they look to the United States example. Again, as Tamara said, it's not that ours is perfect. It never was. It is not. It was enormous work ahead of us to make it a more perfect union. but that we are at least true to our own values, that at least we are trying to work in that direction matters tremendously to our ability to have influence and to be inspiring. And it's also true that our adversaries take significant note of that. If anybody took a look at what was on Russian and Chinese social media over the last 24 hours and on some of their broader media as well, it was an absolute celebration, an absolute attempt to advance their narrative that a Western-style democracy is not a functional form of government. It is not a recipe for stability, and that their models offer something better, a way of trying to advance their influence. So getting our own story right is a huge amount of ability, of influence on our ability to be influential in the Middle East, but anywhere else in the world where these issues are at play. I'll just say briefly that, you know, one of the main issues that the Biden transition has highlighted, in addition to COVID and economic recovery and climate change, for early focus is racial justice. Of course, the issues that were sparked by or brought new attention to by the protests last summer after the murder of George Floyd. But you build out from the concept of a reckoning of systemic racism to talk about equal participation in all aspects of society, economics and healthcare and education, a voting system and a democratic institutions that function and that work well, a law enforcement that follows the rule of law. All of those are aspects of us being able to model, not only to get our own society in the healthy state it needs to be, but to be able to model that to support those who are our partners in a struggle for advancing those values worldwide against others who want to advance very, very different values, like those I just mentioned.
So, you know, despite the best efforts of Trump and his enablers yesterday, we will have a new president in 13 days. And I want to start trying to play out the implications of that around the world and around the region. What impact do you think the change of leadership here is going to have in Israel? Tamara, first, you know, Israel also, of course, has an election coming up. Will having a President Biden in the White House affect Bibi's chances this time?
Wow. Well, let me start, I think, Jonathan, taking a little step back and talking about what Biden brings with him as he enters into office, and what kind of region, what kind of Middle East, and what kind of Israel is going to face that new administration. Right. You know, Biden's got a ton of experience in foreign policy. He's got a ton of relationships inside Israel and around the region. But this is a region that has been through tremendous change over the period of time just since Biden was vice president. And so he can hit the ground running, but the ground has shifted. All right. So that's, I think, the first piece of context. The second piece of context is who Joe Biden is compared to who the current president is and how they approach these relationships. Joe Biden is all about relationships. His whole political career, everything he's done in foreign and domestic policy is about investing in relationships and building partnerships to get things done. That's very senatorial, but I think it's actually a tremendous asset in foreign policy as well. And so I think that it could not be more different from the sort of short-term, self-regarding transactionalism that Donald Trump has brought to foreign policy. You scratch my back, I scratch yours in a very near-term sense. And not thinking about the longer-term implications for a bilateral partnership or for the security and the interests of both parties. So I think that one of the dynamics we've seen in the U.S.-Israel relationship, but more broadly in U.S. relations in the Middle East, is a lot of short-termism. Actors in the region saying, well, that's the way this guy looks at things, so let me grab what I can get right now, and we'll figure out the consequences later. And that's caused misunderstandings, it's caused cross signals, it's sometimes caused crises. And I think that a Biden administration is not going to approach things that way. It's going to try and set a more strategic path. In the right away, what that means is we're going to have a lot of very serious conversations about where we are and where we want to go together. But over the long term, I think it's going to be a much less bumpy, much more consistent, coherent, reliable set of partnerships.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you did ask about the election, and I don't want to dodge. So let me just say this very, very briefly. And Dan's on the ground in Israel as this campaign is heating up. He can say more. I will say one thing about what happened yesterday, which is that I hope Israelis, as they embark on their own political campaign, reflect on the power of words and the way in which rhetoric contributed to the horrific events of yesterday, and they don't follow us down that particular road. I think that the fact that there's an Israeli election and the fact that Joe Biden wants to return to an era in which we are not intervening in one another's domestic politics and we are not using our relationship in domestic politics as a wedge, that means we're going to have to deal with Israel carefully, in a calibrated way, so that we're having the conversations we need to have on urgent issues, but we're not perceived as, even a hint of interfering in Israel's process.
So Dan, let me flip that question to you and just add the note that there were reports in the media earlier this week that Netanyahu aides, including the outgoing Israeli ambassador to the U.S., were already griping about the makeup of Biden's incoming team, specifically about the inclusion of John Kerry and Susan Rice, although neither of them will have jobs that have anything to do with Israel. Clearly, there is a lot of anxiety on the Israeli side that the relationship is going to get a lot more frosty. What do you make of those concerns, and your general thoughts on what the relationship is going to be like?
Well, focusing on individual appointees is always kind of silly, and it's particularly silly when it comes to people who aren't in portfolios that are relevant to those issues. I don't know if what those reports are true, but I found those reports to be not worth spending too much time on. Also, because I don't think they're very reflective of what we know about Joe Biden from his entire career. And his as a senator and as vice president, and how he articulated his plans for this relationship during the campaign. This is a now soon-to-be president who is as knowledgeable and as experienced and as steeped in the U.S.-Israel partnership in all of its aspects, in the common values aspects of the two democracies, in the security partnership, which is so many dimensions now, from assistance, which he's helped craft, to joint training, to intelligence cooperation, to technology development, to standing up for Israel anywhere its legitimacy is challenged or its right to defend itself is challenged, whether in the United Nations or at home with the BDS movement. These are fundamental aspects of Joe Biden's political and personal identity. Not positions he's adopted for some kind of short-term gain. He's talked about them and lived them really for decades without wavering. So I think as the fundamentals of what he brings to the relationship, that's not something that should be left behind. That doesn't mean that there may not be disagreements between the two countries, and it doesn't mean that there may not be differences between a Biden administration's policies and the Trump administration's policies, including some that many Israelis supported. And that's where, as Tamara said, this is something that can be managed, as we've always been able to manage between two allies through the right kinds of consultations. The specifics around those reports, of course, were is the Biden administration going to pursue an Iran policy that many Israelis disagree with? And whether it's on Iran or it's on Palestinians, one thing I would counsel any Israeli is you should probably not start from a proposition of trying to convince the Biden administration to adopt the Trump administration's policies if the candidate and soon-to-be president has already articulated something different. That's probably not a very successful recipe. But particularly around this issue, which has gotten so much attention already, even before he's taken office, of will the United States return to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which he has said he would in the context of mutual compliance. And Israelis are arguing that that would be a bad idea, and they associate it with some of the former officials who may be returning to new roles. What that is about, of course, is that Joe Biden will be coming into office at a time when the Trump administration having withdrawn from the nuclear deal, which kept Iran from at least a year from the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. And with Iran having responded by violating its own commitments under the deal, by enriching uranium, stockpiling it, now enriching at higher levels, installing centrifuges, Iran is now much closer, perhaps 2 months, 3 months from the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. This is an emergency situation created by the collapse of the deal. When Iran was this close to a nuclear weapon in 2011 and 2012, there was a very serious debate within Israel about whether to conduct a military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. So it needs to be dealt with. One way of dealing with it, but perhaps it's not the only way, but it's the way that the Biden administration incoming has said, is to see if it can get Iran to return to compliance, to see if so that the United States would re-enter the deal. In so doing, of course, it would restore the U.S. partnership with its European allies, who were also parties to the original deal and very much have tried to preserve it. But that should only be done with the kind of consultation between allies, even during an Israeli election, even in the early months while the Biden administration is still staffing up, that can find ways to narrow areas of disagreement, deal with all of the attendant decisions on structure, on timing, on articulation of leverage, on future goals that will accompany even the first order decision of whether or not to go back into the JCPOA. But much more importantly than that, to chart the strategic course beyond that. What President-elect Biden has said consistently, and I believe this represents an understanding that the JCPOA decision is really a preliminary one. His strategic objective is a much longer term agreement, lasts much longer than the JCPOA, that is much broader in its application to other technologies besides nuclear, also ballistic missile technologies, perhaps drone technologies, and also to Iran's regional behavior, which is malign in so many ways, and that it can be enforced in much stronger ways than the current deal. And on that, there should be a great deal more convergence between U.S. and Israeli positions, and I would argue also Gulf, Arab, and European positions. It is certainly possible to narrow areas of disagreement on a near-term decision while charting a course that has much more convergence on a longer-term strategic decision. And if that is the attitude that both governments bring to those early discussions, I think a lot of this anxiety that is being expressed about are we going to go right back into the arguments we had in 2015 can be overcome.
Tamara, given the scope of the Biden administration's ambitions when it comes to Iran, which Dan just surveyed for us, how do you rate their chances, or our chances, I should say, especially given Iran's recent resumption of production of 20% enriched uranium and its threat to expel inspectors? You know, the Iranians have been saying for years that it's not just about the Trump administration, or that yes, the Trump administration's actions were very worrisome, but what they betray is a greater lack of constancy and reliability on the part of the entire United States. And why, for example, should we think that another deal that we do now will have any better chance of succeeding than the last one, when, after all, we negotiated that in good faith and you guys walked away from it?
Yeah, well, I do think that there is a real concern about an agreement that can be reversed by executive action. And that was a vulnerability of the JCPOA from the beginning. It was a vulnerability, frankly, because there was simply no willingness from a stonewalling Congress to even consider a treaty obligation that would be more reliable. And we, I don't want to revisit that debate and that history, but that was a development encouraged by opponents of the deal in Israel. that ultimately produced a deal that was a weaker and more easily reversed deal. And now we all get to live with the consequences of that, which is that we're 2 months away from nuclear material for a bomb instead of a year. That fact, though, where we are today, that creates urgency. As Dan said, even with an Israeli election, we can't wait to have these conversations in a really serious way. I think it also puts a premium on the kinds of consultations that Dan was describing. I find it frustrating sometimes that that these consultations get discussed almost as if the other signatories to the JCPOA, the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese, they all want to be pro-Iran, and it's only the region that is troubled. We didn't get the JCPOA because everyone else was happy with Iran. We got the JCPOA because the world was worried about Iran's capabilities. We had UN Security Council resolutions on ballistic missile development because the world is concerned about Iran's capabilities. And so I think we need to focus on that shared concern and not let our disagreements about mechanisms get in the way of finding the unified front we need to be effective going forward. So what are the chances of success? The more this is seen as a US-Iran bilateral, are they an adversary, or are we willing to sign an agreement with them? The less chance of success we have. The more that we understand this is a problem of international security, it's a problem that's existential for our regional friends, and we build a united front, I'm pretty confident that we can get some work done. And frankly, from an Iranian perspective too, any agreement you reach is going to be more reliable to the extent that it reflects a wider international consensus, not just the narrow interest of any one party.
I should have mentioned that Iran also has an election coming up, which will further complicate the picture, but we don't need to get into that. I want to remind everybody who's joined us that you can ask questions and make comments on Facebook and on YouTube, and that we will get into them during our Q&A, which will begin momentarily. In fact, as soon as I start hearing from you all. In the meantime, Dan, let me come back to you with a more general question, which is, given all the crises that the incoming Biden administration is going to face, domestically and abroad, starting with the pandemic, starting with the state of the U.S. economy, it is very hard to imagine, for me at least, that they're going to have much time or energy to focus on anything beyond the very, very top of the list. And I can see Iran being at the top of the list, given what we've just said. But beyond that, do you think that issues like the Middle East, the Palestinian-Israeli peace process will even get featured, given how hard it will be to find the time to think about them, let alone do anything about them in the White House and the rest of the government?
Well, you're correct to identify a whole range of priorities before we get to issues related to Israel and the Palestinians or others in the region. Not that they're unimportant, but just it's the world we're living in. Actually, the campaign, when the transition actually launched its website, and I'm not connected to the transition anyway, so I'm speaking as an outsider, but it was about 4 or 5 days after the election, and there were 4 preloaded pages of content, policy content, representing the immediate priorities. One, of course, was COVID relief or recovery. One was economic recovery. One was racial justice, and one was climate change. All of those actually have some sort of nexus to foreign policy, but in the first instance, they're domestic policy issues, and it says a lot about what the administration's priorities will be and what they think the American people will judge them on, at least in the early period. When you shift to the international arena, you mentioned Iran, but that's probably, it may push its way into the top tier of necessity. But really, I think on the sort of proactive agenda of this administration, you'd start with restoring alliances, the transatlantic alliance, particularly with NATO, and the Asian alliances that have been under so much strain during the Trump years. Second would be restoring U.S. leadership in multilateral arenas, whether it's the UN or the World Health Organization or the Paris Climate Accords, and really as the convener and leader on the great transnational challenges, which include COVID, but also and climate change, but also migration, non-proliferation, the democratic versus autocratic rivalry. Then you have China, which will be the major challenge shaping U.S. foreign policy probably for the rest of our careers and maybe the rest of this century. And as economic, as security and military dimensions in the Indo-Pacific, but has economic and values and technology dimensions that stretch throughout the world. And then you have Russia, which is an old new rival, feeling its ability to challenge U.S. interests and those of our allies. So all of those, plus Iran, given that it may be reaching a crisis very early, are on the table long before we get to things about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. That doesn't mean they're unimportant. It doesn't mean they won't be addressed. It probably does mean that they won't be issues that the President of the United States and the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor will necessarily be attending to on a daily basis. And that does have some implications. It doesn't mean no progress can be made, but it does mean that parties in the region will have to be realistic about the kind of attention they're getting, about which officials they will be able to engage with. It does mean that the administration will have to be very precise and very thoughtful about when to engage at high levels and when a decision that cannot be pushed through at a different working level, senior working level, but requires an engagement from the president or the secretary, because if you condition parties to wait for that, they will never make any decisions until they have that kind of attention. And so, I think Tamara will be actually better equipped than I to describe some ways we might work that at a lower level based on a report that she was a co-author of just now. But I do think it's something that both the administration and the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Arabs in the region, and I'll want to get back to talk about Arab normalization a little bit later and how that might be advanced, we'll have to figure out a way to do while the most senior officials are working on other things day to day and find their moments to supplement the work of hopefully a very empowered senior working level team.
Tammy, I want to try and keep things at a fairly high level without getting too much into the mechanics of government, because while that may be interesting to all of us, I don't know if it will be to all of our listeners. So let me ask you a broad question, and one that may sound counterintuitive, which is whether you expect there to be areas of continuity between Biden's Middle East policy and the Trump administration's Middle East policy, given the generally inept way that the administration, this outgoing administration, handled things. That seems unlikely. And yet there are a couple of reasons to take the question seriously. I think one is that there was a surprising degree of continuity in sort of priority or preference, if not in execution, in broad strokes between Obama's Middle East policy and Trump administration's policy in one key way, which was this desire to withdraw, to have less to do with the region if possible, especially when it comes to military involvement, so that the United States could spend its energy and its money rebuilding at home. That was a priority for Obama. That was a priority for Trump. Can we expect that to be a priority for the Biden administration as well? And then, given how ineptly the Trump administration handled its deal of the century with the Palestinians, it's hard to imagine the Biden administration wanting to touch that. But there was another much more positive area or aspect to the Trump administration's Middle East policy, which was, as Dan already alluded to, the normalization of relations with all of these Arab states. And that seems something that the Biden administration would want to push forward. So, so withdrawal on the one hand, or retrenchment, and the Abraham Accords. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Jonathan. So Let me say first, thanks to Dan for mentioning the new report that I co-authored with Ilan Goldenberg of the Center for New American Security and Michael Koplow of the Israel Policy Forum. That is the result of a year's worth of work looking at how the United States needs to reshape its policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And, you know, just very, I won't get into the weeds. I hope that folks will get a chance to take a look at least at the executive summary. But I will simply say that although there is no rational reason to make this a high level, you know, demand on presidential time or to have a special envoy appointed on day one, it is not an issue that I think the United States can afford to ignore or just put on the back burner or try to manage. And we've got a lot of recommendations about what to do instead. So here's where, and you know, this gets to the broader retrenchment point here, Jonathan. I don't like the language of retrenchment or withdrawal. I don't actually think that that's an accurate description of what either Obama or Trump were trying to do. Obama was driven by two things. One was a desire to bring an end to the military conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan that were sapping, yes, our national budget, exhausting our military forces, and really distorting the shape of our military forces from, you know, the military that was capable of confronting great power conflicts. To one that was all about special operations and counterinsurgency. The global war on terror was not a good recipe for America's global strength, ultimately. And so we had to take that in hand, and the American people made clear in multiple electoral outcomes that they wanted to turn the page on those wars. So that was the first driver. The second driver was the rise of China and the renewal of global geopolitical competition and the need for the United States to prepare itself for that. If you have two aircraft carrier groups stationed in the Gulf around the calendar, then you have one less for everywhere else in the world. You know, it's a zero-sum game in terms of military resources. So ending the wars enabled you to shift forces to Asia. That was what Obama was working on, okay? And the rise of ISIS derailed that to a degree, especially in the last few years of the administration. Continuity and change, yeah, I think Trump, you know, Trump's national defense strategy and national security strategy was all about competition with Russia and China. So they bought into that broad construct. They wanted to finish the war with ISIS and move on. President Biden entering office, I think, has an opportunity working with regional partners to solidify the gains against these terrorist actors, to engage in now the diplomatic work of conflict resolution, of consolidating Iraq, of helping Iraq become economically and politically stronger, of ending the war in Syria, closing space for these terrorist actors so that we don't have to go back to using military force against these problems, so that safe havens for terrorism are closed down. Same thing in Afghanistan. So the project is still there, but the tools you use are diplomatic, not military. So it's not about retrenchment. It's about what tools are you using, okay? I don't think anyone is saying the United States should withdraw its diplomatic tools or its economic tools from the Middle East. I certainly wouldn't advocate that. Now, that I do think that brings me to, you know, the Arab-Israeli arena and the Israeli-Palestinian arena. What we've seen is that the security threats in the region and this concern, so shared threats from ISIS and from Iran, and uncertainty about American commitment because of Trump's incoherence, helped bring our friends in the region together and break through barriers that were, frankly, you know, hard to imagine that they would bring their relationships out into the open in the way that they did over the last year. I will say as well that I think for some of these guys in all the conversations I've had, one motivating factor was the prospect of preparing for a post-Trump Washington. And, you know, that's a fine motivation too. So now there's something to build on here. All kinds of regional cooperation are possible now. as a result of the formalization of what had been covert relationships. The Biden team had made clear from the beginning that they welcomed the Abraham Accords, that they wanted to build on them. I fully expect they will do so. There's a lot of opportunity. But I do think we have to recognize that the Abraham Accords, as valuable as they are, do not allow Israel or the Arab world or the United States to circumvent the core of the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have to remember that all of us, the whole region, the world, dodged a bullet this last year. If Israel had gone down the road of formal legal annexation in the West Bank, we would have been in an entirely different universe right now. We would be having a completely different conversation. But we cannot take that for granted. So I don't think we will or we should ignore the necessity of working that issue.
Dan, I saw you raising your hand at one point. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. I just want to jump in and emphasize some points I think Tamara raised on the Abraham Accords. It was, at least as I could calculate, the only Trump foreign policy initiative about which President-elect Biden had something positive to say during the election campaign. He welcomed it immediately, the UAE and Bahrain deals, both in terms of the rightness of it, the fact that this was something that all American administrations and he personally had worked on to help Israel gain its rightful recognition among its neighbors, and on the strategic benefit of having U.S. partners become open partners, and not on the model of the cold peace that Egypt and Jordan have sustained with Israel for several decades, but rather through a broad, warmer, open kind of relationship in which there's not only security cooperation, as important as that is, but cultural interchange, economic, tourism, technology, energy, water exchanges that can be beneficial, obviously, for those countries, but really become beneficial to a much wider circle of countries as well. And so he said, not only did he support it, but he would actively work to advance it, and he would challenge other Arab states to keep pace with the UAE and Bahrain, and obviously there's some others that have joined since, but there's much work that can still be done on that. Now, he may have a different approach. It may not be quite as transactional as the Trump model. If Saudi Arabia, which we all would love to see normalized with Israel, thinks that we'll get an F-35 package at the same time that President-elect Biden is talking about a reassessment of that relationship. I'm not sure that's realistic, but that doesn't mean this can't be advanced. There's lots of creative ways you can do this, and he fully intends to do that. But it's also true that he added something. He added two things that were different from Trump. One was picking up on Tamara's point that one of the great benefits of the UAE deal was that it sidelined the prospect of unilateral annexation in the West Bank. That became essentially an either-or choice for the Israelis, and fortunately they made a good choice, and that sidelined that prospect. But second, he said he believes that these new normalized relations between Israel and Arab neighbors can actually become, if they're used effectively, a source of generating positive momentum on the Israeli-Palestinian trend to help keep that two-state solution alive and viable. Because the logic of it hasn't changed. If Israel normalizes its relations with every Arab state, and I hope it will, and I'm sure the Biden administration will work toward that, it won't change the fundamental necessity of a separation between Israelis and Palestinians to keep Israel true to its Jewish and democratic nature, with all the implications that has for the U.S.-Israel partnership, to ensure Palestinians' legitimate rights of independence can also be achieved. So that's not going to change. And in fact, these new relationships can become quite positive generators of progress. It doesn't mean they will solve it. Again, if the administration is putting this in the basket of something they try to sustain a two-state solution rather than push immediately to achieve it, you don't need to count on those Arab states to deliver the ultimate outcome. But the kind of dialogue that a normalized country with Israel like the UAE can now have with the Israeli public and the Israeli government about what steps Israel can and should take or not take in this arena is very, very different than any Arab state has been able to have with Israel so far. The kind of support they can provide for Palestinians economically and in institution building, but also perhaps some positive pressure on helping Palestinians make adjustments to their approach, how they educate their public, how they speak about their aspirations, is also very different once they're in this arena. So I would expect to see a Biden administration both try to advance what has been achieved and give credit for it being one of the positive outcomes of these last 4 years, but also link it in a way the Trump administration clearly didn't to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, even if it's on a longer timeline.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jonathan. And if I can just add there, one of the most damaging consequences of the Trump policy with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the way in which Trump, through his actions, undermined the ability of the United States to have an effective relationship, just diplomatic, bilateral relationship with the Palestinians, with the Palestinian people, much less with the Palestinian leadership. And we can't effectively even, really support Israel in its own needs, in its relationships with the Palestinians, if we don't have a channel to the Palestinians. Right now, we do not. Their mission in Washington is closed. Our consulate in Jerusalem was eliminated. So it is imperative for the United States to reopen those channels to the Palestinians. And I think it is also wise for the United States to build up its relationships across Palestinian society. Just as we have a moment now with the Abraham Accords, with these, wonderful scenes of Israelis and Emiratis doing online yoga classes together, having these kind of people-to-people exchanges. We have to make sure that America is engaging with Palestinians as they go through their own very overdue and necessary governmental reforms, as they work to decide what their next steps are in their relationship with Israel. We need to have that line of communication wide open. So I do hope that we'll see a resumption of U.S. assistance to the Palestinian people. I hope that we will see American attention to the really dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. I hope that we will see the United States facilitating joint COVID response between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, because Israelis and Palestinians, neither population can be safe from this pandemic until they are both safe.
Dan, how much do you know about what's going on inside Palestine right now in a couple of key areas? First of all, how would you gauge the appetite for re-engagement with the United States, given that the relationship has been entirely shut down at this point, not just by the Americans, but by the Palestinians as well? And is there a Palestinian leadership to speak of right now? Abbas is now very old and very sick. There doesn't seem to be at least any kind of a public grooming of his successor or talk about a succession process, democratic or otherwise. What's happening there?
I think Palestinians do see an opportunity to re-engage with the United States in a way that has not been going on for the last 3 years. When the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, essentially from that point forward in late 2017, there's been virtually no diplomatic contact between the Palestinian Authority and the United States. Some back channels and some other channels, but the main diplomatic channels were then further closed off by the closing of the PLO office and the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. And the Palestinians bear their share of responsibility for that. I don't think that was necessarily a smart decision on their part. But on the other hand, anybody who wants to be the mediator of a conflict, as the Trump administration said they did in this conflict, has to be able to talk to both sides. And that was not something they were ever able to overcome. So it's certainly a U.S. interest, if we have any hope of managing this conflict, of sustaining a two-state solution, of eventually helping them negotiate an outcome to it, of having those kinds of relationships. So the Palestinians have heard certainly what President-elect Biden said during the campaign, that he wants to restore that relationship. He wants to restore a consulate in Jerusalem while leaving the U.S. Embassy to Israel in Jerusalem. He wants to open the PLO office. He wants to restore assistance to the Palestinian people that can be restored. Some of that assistance, by the way, is restricted because of a law called the Taylor-Force Act. This is a law that withholds assistance to the Palestinian Authority because of payments they make to terrorists who have committed acts of violence and are in Israeli prisons. President-elect Biden supports that law. In fact, he was in Israel. I was with him in Shimon Peres's office when Taylor Force, an American veteran and student, was murdered on a Jaffa beach about a mile away. He supports that law and has said to the Palestinians through the channels that, or through his public statements, that he would restore the other streams of assistance that are not covered by that law to the Palestinian people, to healthcare institutions, humanitarian and economic aid that does not go to the Palestinian Authority, but that he would also expect them to address that. Now, those are all ways that very early on, the Biden administration could show it's prepared to engage differently with the Palestinians than the Trump administration did. But one of the things I hear from Palestinians is that they take seriously, at least some do, I don't want to speak for everybody, that they need to at least be able to meet that administration part way. And there is a serious discussion underway. I can't speak to what if the results will be, but there's a serious discussion underway in Palestinian society, in the Palestinian business community, among at least some people in decision-making roles in the Palestinian Authority, about the need to address their prisoner payment law, to actually end that reprehensible practice in a way that would take that off the table and further signal, as we all want them to do, the illegitimacy of violence to their own public, so that that can be a signal to the Israeli people that there is actually a partner with whom to work. That would be a very beneficial early sign. I can't predict what it would be, but I do know that that discussion is underway, and that realization that a Biden administration isn't just going to deliver everything to them, it's also going to expect Palestinians to contribute something to improving the environment, and not only ask Israelis to contribute something. Now, the Palestinian leadership situation is very challenging. Of course, they are in the process of a leadership transition. We don't know how long that will last. Obviously, President Abbas is not a young man, but the process by which his successor will emerge is not clear. Neither is the timeline. For now, he is the address. But I do think there are some very impressive younger Palestinian. Again, many of them not in direct decision-making roles, but they're in the business community. They're in the high-tech community. They have gained influence talking to their colleagues in governing circles that we should also be talking to. We shouldn't limit this conversation to one Palestinian leader, and obviously we need to be prepared to deal with who follows President Abbas, and probably aware of our limitations on being able to influence that in any direction or in a positive direction. So it's a challenge, but there's much that can be done even before that transition fully unfolds that improves the situation in which that next Palestinian leader will arrive, and at least we hopefully can shorten the distance to the next negotiation between Israeli and Palestinian leaders that are actually prepared to negotiate.
So we're almost short on time, but Tammy, I want to ask you a question that brings together several listener questions that touch on this in several ways, and they have to do with what's going on vis-a-vis Israel in the American Jewish community and how that relationship is going to play out. So as you know, as we all probably know, there's been a lot of debate within the American Jewish community in recent years about support for Israel, whether it should continue in the way that it always has or whether it needs to change. And there is a lot of survey data showing that younger American Jews are less interested and less supportive of Israel than ever before, in large part because of Israeli policies that they don't agree with. How do you see that playing out in the next few years? Is today's Democratic Party, as a result of these trends, less supportive of Israel than it has been in the past? Will that complicate things for Biden and Harris, despite their own personal inclinations, whatever they are? As you know, and this could be part of the broader negotiation that Biden has to conduct right now between the center and the left of the Democratic Party. You can expect Israel to be a part of that. And then what constructive role can the American Jewish community, which is not monolithic, play in helping preserve the relationship.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks. I think these are important issues to get to, but you packed a lot in there. So let me try to disentangle just a little bit.
And take what you want, because we only have a few minutes.
Okay. The first thing I want to do is say the American Jewish community, as active as it is still a tiny, tiny part of the American electorate and a tiny part of the American Democratic Party. And so I think our voice is important, and I think our role in Democratic Party politics has been important, but those are really two different issues, what's going on in the community and what's going on in the party. Let me talk a little more about what's going on in American politics, because that's really what I know more than Jewish community politics. Every issue here is polarized by party. Every issue. Healthcare, Supreme Court, Israel, Japan, you name it. One side says red, the other side says blue, one side says up, the other side says down. Israel has now been caught up in that. That didn't used to be the case. It has become caught up in that because of this broader polarization trend, and because political leaders on both sides of this bilateral relationship have seen it in their interest to exacerbate that problem. That's to the detriment of the relationship, okay? But what I want people to understand is that Americans across the board still believe in and support the U.S.-Israel relationship. 3/4 of Americans in polls consistently see Israel as a strategic ally. They see shared values. They want a strong partnership. And of course, that's true in the American Jewish community as well. The differences come when you get to the conflict, and specifically when you get to issues in the conflict and issues in Israeli policy that go directly to how Americans think about democracy and about human rights. So one of the biggest trigger issues you see in polls is Israeli demolition of houses filled with families, one member of which committed a violent attack, okay? Closures, which are seen as collective punishment. These are the things that make Americans, especially younger Americans, especially African Americans and Latinos, less comfortable with Israeli policy, less comfortable with American support for Israeli policy. So I really think it's important for people to disaggregate, to understand where this concern is coming from. It's coming from who Americans are. It's coming from our core creed, and it's coming from our shared values. So I think it's very workable, but I think people need to understand it.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to wrap us up here. Again, I want to offer my deep thanks and appreciation to Tamara, to Dan, and to Jonathan for offering so much expert analysis, insight, thoughts, leaving us with possibly more questions and lots of food for thought, of course. And if you have more questions and want to hear more of them, check out everything that they write, okay? Dan Shapiro is prolific at many different media outlets. We put a link to the Washington Post's most recent article, but you can see him all over the place. Again, the lengthy report that is full of interesting perspective from Dr. Wittes and her two other co-authors. And if you're fans of podcasts, have a listen to Rational Security with Dr. Tamara Cofman. Very, very informative podcast. And look at the Foreign Policy playlist to hear Jonathan Tepperman interview a smattering of people around the world on very important issues. And doubtless, of course, there's no doubt that we will have them back with us at some point within the reform movement to talk and to listen to them and to hear what they have to say and share with us. And hopefully we'll be able to look after the inauguration to some of the things that will be implemented on some of the questions that we've asked so far. So again, thank you to the three of you for taking your time. I know it's already late in the evening in Israel, Dan, so appreciate you taking time from your family in the evening now. And I want to say thank you to all who listened. But please stay tuned. We will now be coming to you monthly with joint Artsenu programs with all of the Artsa regions around the world in the reform movement, and we're pleased to do that. Our next one will be on January 28th. I know those of you recognize that date, but it is also Tu B'Shvat Makia. So tune in for a critical discussion about the state of Israeli democracy. Not only will we be hearing from experts like Labor MK Merav Michaeli and Rabbi Ofik Meir, the headmaster of the Leo Beck School in Haifa, but also some perspectives from 4 Israeli teenagers who attend that school, the Reform Movement's high school in Israel, who will share from their perspective how they see some of the issues heading into, of course, a 4th Israeli election in under 2 years. So I hope you join us for that and more as we approach the Israeli election March 23rd. And again, I want to thank Dan and Tamara and Jonathan for sharing their deep personal perspectives on the horrific events of yesterday. And I know that many of us are still processing those, and hopefully that will be the end of that violence that we saw as we're leading up to the inauguration. So I want to wish everyone an early Shabbat Shalom, and to thank you so much for joining us, and to stay tuned for more.